The committee meets today to consider House Resolution 459, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2011, H.R. 4155, the Veterans Skills and Jobs Act, H.R. 4331, the Government Spending Accountability Act, short name GSA Act of 2012, H.R. 6016, the Government Employee Accountability Act, and the semi-annual activity report of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and several postal naming resolutions. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The committee will now consider H.R. 459, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2011. Without objection, H.R. 459 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in folders at all your tables. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 459, a bill to require a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General of the United States before the end of 2012 and for other purposes.
I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute which has been distributed. Without objection, the amendment will be considered read and original text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. H.R. 459, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, directs the General Accountability Office to conduct a full audit of the Federal Reserve. The Dodd-Frank legislation mandated a GAO audit of the Fed, but that audit issued by the GAO in July 2011 focused solely on certain issues concerning emergency credit facilities. GAO remains restricted under current law from concluding a broader audit of the Federal Reserve that includes, for instance, a review of the Fed's monetary policy operations and its agreement with foreign governments and central banks. Under this bill, the GAO has an investigative arm of Congress, a nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress, is allowed to conduct an audit that reviews all of the transactions and is required to report the findings of such an audit to Congress. Well, Congress should not and will not manage the Fed's or the details of monetary policy. It needs to understand, at least in retrospect, how the Fed does its work and whether or not it is in fact in the best interest of the American people. The Fed was created by Congress to be independent of influence of the U.S. Treasury. The Fed remains ultimately responsible to the American people and its elected representatives. Over the last several years, the relationship between Treasury and the Fed has undeniably become nearly lockstep. In particular, it is particularly appropriate that we consider the legislation at this time. In recent years, the Fed's extraordinary interventions have led some to call into question its independence. I hope we can all agree that we do not need a second Treasury Department. We need a responsible and independent central bank. H.R. 459 has strong bipartisan support with 253 co-sponsors, including many members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. My amendment in the nature of a substitute simply modifies the due date of the audit to give the GAO a full calendar year to conduct its work. I urge members to approve H.R. 459 as amended. I now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 459 requires a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General. I certainly support the aim of this legislation, but I am concerned that the impact would be to make far-reaching and unprecedented changes to the very nature of the Federal Reserve by limiting the independence that has for decades been the cornerstone of that institution. Let me be clear. It is not necessary for Congress to pass this Act to conduct an audit of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Banking Agency Audit Act of 1978 opened the Federal Reserve System to audit, and regular audits have been conducted since that date. More recently, in response to the concerns of many members, myself included, regarding the extraordinary measures undertaken by the Fed during the financial crisis, The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act significantly expanded GAO's ability to audit Fed activities. First, Section 1109 of Dodd-Frank required GAO to audit the emergency financial assistance provided by the Federal Reserve during the financial crisis. In July 2011, GAO released the audit required by this section. More broadly, under Dodd-Frank, the Federal Reserve's open market transactions and discount window operations are subject to audit to assess their operational integrity, accounting, financial reporting, and internal controls. Further, the Federal Reserve's Board's Open Market Committee's meeting minutes are now released just weeks after the meetings occur, while full transcripts of the meetings are released after a 5-year delay. In recognition of the Fed's independence, the Federal Banking Agency Audit Act specifically prohibited the GAO from reviewing the following: transactions with foreign central banks or governments, deliberations, decisions, or actions on monetary matters, transactions made under the direction of the Federal Open Market Committee, and communications among or between members of the Board and officers and employees of the Federal Reserve System related to these issues. The Federal Reserve is an independent central bank, and that independence is critical to its ability to conduct monetary policy in pursuit of its dual mandate of promoting maximum employment and stable prices. While many believe that submitting the Federal Reserve's monetary policy deliberations to audit will expand transparency, the reality is that subjecting these deliberations to audit, including audits without any significant elapse of time from the point of decision, could influence how they are conducted and potentially even the policies that are chosen, thus degrading the true independence of the Federal Reserve. Additionally, if all restrictions on GAO's ability to audit the Federal Reserve's deliberative processes are removed, members of Congress could seek to influence the Federal Reserve's deliberations in specific directions by the types and subjects of audits they request. Members could seek to obtain from GAO documents related to the Federal Reserve's deliberations, including internal emails between Board members and between Board members and staff of the Federal Reserve. I do believe the Federal Reserve's operation should be subject to thorough review. However, I believe that actions that would impede the independence of the Federal Reserve to implement monetary policies responsive to our nation's current economic situation and supportive of its congressionally established mandates should be rejected. For these reasons, I will propose several amendments in order to address these concerns. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll hold the record open until the end of the day, so any member may submit a written statement.
Mr. Chair.
Just a moment. Do any member I apologize. I'm going to recognize the subcommittee, one member from each side. I would now recognize Mr. Gosar of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak to the committee today in support of Congressman Paul's bill, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. In fact, I am a co-sponsor of the legislation. The Federal Reserve System of the United States is an extremely powerful entity. The Fed controls the dollar and sets associated interest rates. Profits earned on the interest by the Fed are paid into the U.S. Treasury. Though the Fed is a quasi-private entity, its chairman, vice chairman, and governors are appointed by the President and vetted by the Senate. Further, the decisions made and executed by the Fed's Board of Governors affect the monetary policy of the entire nation. Thus, the system must be subject to Federal oversight and audit. Currently, Congress is able to probe such areas within the Fed, but there is still far too much that is not known. Congress and the American people must be allowed to know the details of its operations and how decisions are made. I agree with Congressman Paul that the best government is an open government. As members of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, each of us is tasked with holding all government entities accountable for their actions and inactions. The American people deserve answers and transparency from their government. An open democracy such as ours does not condone secrecy, except in the most stringent cases of national security. Scores of my constituents in Arizona have called on me to investigate and audit the Fed and its practices. For these reasons, I have joined Congressman Paul as a co-sponsor of this bill, and I am now seeking to enact this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of the amendment. The Federal Reserve must be subject to audit because it received a delegation of power from Congress, and Congress is constitutionally obligated to conduct oversight. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States said that Congress has the power to coin or create money. We delegated that power in 1913 to the Federal Reserve. But what's happened is the Federal Reserve has turned into a black box. We delegated the greatest power in this country, the money power. And it's a black box where the Federal Reserve can create money out of nothing with a convention called quantitative easing. And yet they can create money out of nothing, and their creation is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. What's going on here? We have to understand that there's no reason why the Fed's monetary policy operations should be exempt from audit, and that the Fed audit that's authorized by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act is insufficient because it's not a full or substantive audit. The GAO did report on the details of its emergency bank lending, and the Fed has published some other details, but the rest of the data we received came about as a result of lawsuits and not because of congressional action or GAO reports. The Fed was required under Dodd-Frank to disclose much of the data from its emergency credit lending facilities set up during the financial crisis. Most of the other data on its activities, such as open market operations and discount window lending, have only been published because of lawsuits, and Dodd-Frank requires this information to be disclosed going forward, but with a 2-year time lag, and with GAO restricted auditing only the procedural components of any programs. Now, this bill grants GAO and Congress access without special exemptions and ensures that all of the Fed's lending actions during a financial crisis or in the future will be subject to oversight. Now, I fought hard to have a partial audit included in the Dodd-Frank bill. The GAO report examined the emergency actions taken by the Fed from December 1, 2007 through July 21, 2010. And one of the things we learned from that report, which is quite remarkable even under the circumstances, is that the Fed management did not take steps to deal with the risk or the perception of conflicts of interest by immediately establishing a task force to develop guidance for Fed staff from the outset. The fact is they showed complete disregard for the potential financial losses which may have arisen from the Fed's programs to assist banks and other financial institutions. Losses would have impacted on the amount the Fed remits to the Treasury, affecting public budgets. And we should also remember that despite the audit power under Dodd-Frank, it took a Federal lawsuit by news organizations to get the Fed to reveal a fuller picture of its actions during the crisis. So this is what we found when the GAO was only able to check the oil. Imagine what we'd find if we let the mechanics do a full diagnostic. This kind of secrecy is a predictable consequence of the bigger conflict of interest of having a central bank and primary regulator which is essentially owned by private entities that is tasked with controlling and regulating. It's far too cozy an arrangement. And that's one of the reasons why, Mr. Chairman, I've introduced a bill, H.R. 2990, which puts the Fed back under Treasury. This money power cannot be trusted in the hands of a few banks who the Fed then helps to fund, creates the money out of nothing, gives it to banks, and what have the banks done? Check your districts out. See how businesses are starving on the vine because they can't get capital. Well, the Fed has this deal going with private banks, and they do it without transparency. Now, an audit is not going to harm the Fed's independence. It's independent from the executive branch, but guess what? It is not independent from Congress. We're created by Article 1. We're first among equals. We have not only the ability, but the responsibility to audit the Fed. And the Fed was created by Congress, and it's always been subject to congressional regulation, oversight, and amendment. And this whole idea about, well, we can't touch the Fed is baloney. We have to be able to have control over the Federal Reserve because it's controlling every aspect of our economy. So the ISO amendment is not going to interfere with the Fed's monetary policy actions. It merely grants Congress retrospective access to information used to determine and carry out monetary policy. So for that reason, I support the amendment. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the amendment. There is no reason why there should be a partisan divide over what is essentially a congressional function that the Founders saw fit to reserve to the Congress itself. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word in support of
The gentleman is recognized.
In support of H.R. 459. I appreciate the work of Dr. Ron Paul and his passion and tenacity in pursuing this. Openness and transparency should be the hallmark of our government. It is very difficult to see what is happening in there. This is just good common sense. It's very bipartisan. I believe last time in the last Congress there were more than 300 co-sponsors of that bill, including Barney Frank and other notables on both sides of the aisle. I thought Speaker Pelosi should have brought it up then. I'm proud of the fact that we're actually going to pass this out of committee, I hope, today, and that would urge a consideration by the Speaker to bring it to the floor. I hope that will happen in July. But this is just good common sense government. It's openness, it's transparency. More information and the power of more people should be the hallmark of our nation. And again, I rise in support of this and appreciate the work of Ron Paul on this issue. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Just to speak
Strike
on
the last word. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that I'm always concerned when Representative Ice and Representative Kucinich agree on something. Usually throws up some red flags for me. But
yield?
No, I will not yield. The gentleman has had ample time to speak on this, but I don't condemn either party for their agreement. I think it lies in the substance of the bill. I do agree, especially with the experience that we have had in this crisis, with the extraordinary action by the Fed on many levels in dealing with this, that it requires us to demand greater transparency. I commend the Chairman on his co-sponsorship, and I commend my colleague and friend, Mr. Kucinich, for actually supporting a measure of responsible nature such as this. And so I do indeed join them in endorsing this bill and recommending its passage. And I yield back to the gentleman from Ohio.
I want to thank Mr. Lynch for his sensitivity on this, because when this country was facing the financial crisis, you raised a lot of issues with respect to defending the middle-class interests and helping keep people in their homes. And one of the concerns that I've had is that the Fed knew fully well what was going on with the meltdown in the economy. They played footsie with these same interests that sank and annihilated the interests of the American people. And so this particular bill, well, you are correct, Mr. Lynch, in observing that it is unusual that Mr. Issa and I should be working together on something. I say that sets a wonderful precedent, and may this be the beginning of an even better relationship. Thank you. I yield back.
Would the gentleman further yield?
I will yield.
I think the gentleman from Ohio forgets that for a number of years, as we worked first as my subcommittee and then his subcommittee, we actually have had a lot of areas we agreed on. And one of the most important ones, I think, has always been transparency in government. And, I think where we agree is that the Fed is government and ultimately needs transparency. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Would the gentleman just yield back so I could respond? I want to thank the Chair.
At the danger of getting too schmaltzy, I'll continue to yield.
There's never a danger of that in this place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing no one else, does anyone offer? Oh, slow but sure. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this important legislation, and I'd like to quote my colleague and good friend, Dr. Ron Paul, who's worked so tirelessly on this issue for so many years. Quote, Congress must maintain oversight of the Fed and ensure the transparency of its credit facilities. The Federal Reserve System is the epitome of crony capitalism. It exemplifies the collusion between big government and big business to profit at the expense of taxpayers. I would hope that even supporters of the Fed would agree that as long as the Federal Reserve exists, it should be fully audited, end quote. And I quote again, in his 1974 Nobel Prize address, the late Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek attacked the pretense of knowledge. The idea that policymakers have sufficient knowledge and power to shape society as they wish. Our political leaders failed to take Hayek's message to heart, as succeeding generations have continued to allow this intellectual arrogance to continue unabated. Congress has abdicated its oversight over these, quote, expert economists at the Federal Reserve to the detriment of the economic well-being of the American people, end quote. Mr. Chairman, our constituents would be shocked to know that, as Congressman Paul said, the Fed has more pronounced effect on the economy than any law Congress has ever passed. Congressional oversight of the Fed amounts to about 12 hours of hearings per year, and that's as far as it goes. Of those 12 hours, no more than 5 or 10 minutes goes to any one congressman who has the opportunity to ask at most one question of Chairman Bernanke every 6 months. To claim that this is effective oversight is laughable. The Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress and should be treated as such, not as an organization exempt from congressional oversight. Again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing this bill forward. Our job as members of this committee is to ensure that government is transparent and held accountable to the American people. This is exactly what the Audit the Fed bill does. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. If no one else seeks recognition, we're open for amendment. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment number 85 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment.
Or read the amendment, I'm sorry.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 45.
I ask unanimous consent to be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I am offering would ensure that the audit required by this bill does not intrude on the Federal Reserve's independence by amending the legislation to keep the deliberations conducted by the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors regarding monetary policy closed to review by GAO. Additionally, my amendment would ensure that discussions or communications among or between members of the Federal Reserve Board or between board members and officers and employees of the Federal Reserve System regarding monetary policy remain protected. As I said in my opening statement, the Federal Reserve's independence from political interference is central to its functioning. This independence is critical to ensuring that the Board of Governors can implement the monetary policy measures they determine to be most responsive to our nation's economic needs and most likely to fulfill the Federal Reserve's dual mandate of maximizing employment and stabilizing prices. Exercising their independence during the financial crisis, the Fed has been able to implement monetary policies that have been essential to strengthening and stabilizing our economy. As I said, I certainly support expanded transparency over the Federal Reserve's operations. For that reason, I supported the provisions in Dodd-Frank that ensured the Fed's extraordinary lending facilities were fully audited. I also supported the provisions in Dodd-Frank to enable GAO to audit open market transactions and other Fed transactions to ensure that risk is adequately managed and that appropriate financial controls are in place. And I supported the expanded data disclosures required by Dodd-Frank. Under these requirements, certain information regarding discount window lending and open market operations is released on a 2-year delay. Dodd-Frank was carefully crafted to ensure that long overdue transparency was brought to the Fed's operations without impeding the Fed's ability to carry out the critical responsibility of independently setting our nation's monetary policy. Our committee has not held a single hearing on this bill. We should not rush into any measure that will in any way alter the independence without thoughtful reflection on the consequences of such a step on the Federal Reserve System and, more importantly, on our nation. I urge members to protect the independence of the nation's central bank by adopting the amendment. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The amendment essentially guts this bill. It rolls back to Dodd-Frank, the limitations. And let's understand, as we speak today, a Federal Reserve that took 93 years to get to $900 billion on its balance sheet during this administration has risen to nearly $3 trillion. The official figures of $2.9 trillion actually pale in comparison to the unwinding risk. The Operation Twist is currently buying, in addition to quantitative easing, is currently buying long-term debt that could quickly change in value in return for short-term loaning. The fact is that when you wind that way, you have an even balance sheet. But when you unwind a 30-year note or a 20-year note versus short-term money, you could find yourself evaporating hundreds of billions of dollars in a matter of weeks. Too big to fail was the subject and the buzzword for Dodd-Frank. At $3 trillion or more, clearly the Fed must be made too big to fail, and too big to fail requires a considerable amount of oversight. Today, the transparency of banks and their monetary policy, including, I might note, a $2 billion loss amid multiple billions of dollars in profit at J.P. Morgan, led to Senate oversight, the hauling in of their president, and endless questions and recriminations. If we hold a bank that is a fraction the size of the Federal Reserve to be hauled up overnight over a loss which pales in comparison to the one that the Fed could have in a matter of minutes in shifting sands, we in fact hold ourselves to no standard at all. Ultimately, the ranking member might be well-intended in this amendment, but he is asking us not to see what we have never seen, not to know what we don't know, and not to have the ability for the GAO, a nonpartisan organization, to evaluate, or at least in hindsight to know whether or not the risk-taking process stands the scrutiny of a stress test. So the words of Dodd-Frank, too big to fail, stress test, need to know, and transparency are just as applicable in this bill with the Fed as they were with smaller banks, much smaller banks, that were considered so critical as to, in fact, have a level of oversight after 100 years of banking history that is dramatically more than it was before. And I might mention again that the ranking member wanted us to see Jamie Dimon. He wanted us to get personally involved in a $2 billion trading loss. Why in the world, when we have $3 trillion at risk, would we want to not know what the ranking member's amendment would have us not know? And I yield to my friend from Cleveland.
Time when it's appropriate.
Okay.
Yield?
I'd yield.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to withdraw this amendment, and I'm hoping that we, too, will hear from Mr. Dimon over that $2 billion loss that you just spoke about, but I withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman has withdrawn, but I believe there's another amendment. I'd continue yielding to you so that you could speak on my time.
I want to thank my colleague from Maryland for his thoughtfulness. Again, my concern is that this is innately a power under Article I that the Congress has to be able to create or coin money. We delegated that to the Federal Reserve in the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. We have a fundamental obligation here to the American people and the economy to be able to know how this Fed operates. And so I'm very grateful to Mr. Cummings for his thoughtfulness and giving us another opportunity to be heard. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else seek recognition on an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The gentleman from Maryland.
Number 84.
The clerk will read amendment number 84.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 459, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
That it be considered as read, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment I'm offering would require GAO to perform an audit of the independent disclosure reviews currently being conducted by the Federal Reserve in the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency as part of their enforcement actions against more than a dozen supervised financial institutions. In April 2011, the Federal Reserve and other prudential regulators announced the results of their review of foreclosure processes and procedures at 14 mortgage servicers, which together comprise two-thirds of the mortgage servicing market. And through this review, which included examinations of a small sample of loan files, the regulators found, quote, unsafe and unsound practices and violations of applicable Federal and State law and requirements, end quote, at these banks. The review also concluded that these violations have had an adverse effect on the functioning of mortgage markets and have widespread consequences for the national housing market and borrowers. Acting on their findings, the Federal Reserve and the other regulators announced formal enforcement actions against the financial institutions that own or oversee the 14 mortgage servicing companies. The enforcement actions were intended to address a pattern of misconduct and negligence related to deficient practices in residential mortgage loan servicing and foreclosing processing. Under the enforcement action, each financial institution was required to retain an independent firm to conduct a review of residential foreclosure actions that were pending at any time from January 1, 2009 through December 31, 2010, to determine any financial injury to borrowers caused by errors, misrepresentations, or other deficiencies identified in the review and to remediate as appropriate those deficiencies. Each financial institution also was required to establish a process under which borrowers who believe they may have been harmed by the servicer's actions can request an independent review of their loan histories. On May 31, 2012, fewer than 200,000 borrowers out of about 4.4 million who were eligible had requested an independent review of their foreclosure case for a response rate of 4.4%. The deadline by which such reviews must be requested has been extended twice and is now set to end in September. I am deeply troubled by the low number of eligible borrowers who have requested reviews of their loan files. It is also unclear how the types and amounts of remediation are being determined or how borrowers are being evaluated to determine the type of remediation to which they are entitled. The amendment I am offering would require GAO to conduct a thorough audit of the process by which the Federal Reserve has overseen the review of borrowers' loan files. Specifically, my amendment would require GAO to examine the following: the guidance given by the Federal Reserve to independent consultants retained by the supervised financial institutions regarding the procedures to be followed in conducting the file reviews, the factors considered by independent consultants when evaluating loan files, the results obtained by independent consultants pursuant to their reviews, the determinations made by consultants regarding the nature and extent of financial injury, as well as the level and type of remediation offered to each homeowner, and the specific measures taken by the independent consultants to verify, confirm, rebut the assertions and representations made by supervised financial institutions regarding the contents of loan files and the extent of financial injury. I am hopeful that this audit will bring greater transparency to this extraordinarily important process. This will enable us to ensure that these financial institutions are being held accountable, that the enforcement actions have identified every harmed borrower, and that borrowers have received fair compensation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I urge support of the amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself in support of the gentleman's amendment. Although much of the amendment is already underway, or the items asked for in the amendment are already underway, I believe that the gentleman and my interest and the work that we did up in Brooklyn at our field hearing shows that, in fact, it should be relatively easy for this information to be compiled and made available. Additionally, I believe it strongly shows bipartisan support for that kind of accountability, and I would urge my colleagues to support this as part of the transparency that I believe we all need. I yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
I thank the gentleman, thank the Chair for supporting this. I certainly support it. I thank Mr. Cummings for his relentless defense of those who are trying to save their homes. And you know, there's a gap here. We don't know about the performance and the efforts that have been made, and we have to look at these files. So I appreciate the fact that Mr. Cummings had the foresight to include this in the bill, and also I want to go on record as thanking Representative Ron Paul for his work on a larger issue here with respect to the Federal Reserve. We wouldn't be at this moment except for his diligence, and I was proud to work with him in the early stages of this. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and without wanting to seem like we're continuing the love fest, I want to personally thank Mr. Kucinich. Long before many people on the dais were even here, we went to Cleveland together for a field hearing that you, in fact, were instrumental in, and it showed us the crisis before it happened, when it was beginning to happen in Ohio. And I'll never forget that you saw it coming in Cleveland before the world saw it happening all across America, and you've been a diligent fighter to try to prevent it, and then ultimately the work you've done to try to remediate. And I won't forget that as we continue to work together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I yield back. If there's no further debate on the amendment, all those in favor say aye. 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 Any opposed? In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none, all those in favor of passing the bill as amended, if there are no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 459 to the House with the recommendation that it do pass as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. In the opinion of the Chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill without objection, so ordered. The committee will now consider H.R. 4155, the Veterans Skills to Jobs Act. Without objection, H.R. 4155 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4155, a bill to direct the head of each Federal department and agency to treat relevant military training as sufficient to satisfy training or certification requirements for Federal licenses.
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment in the nature of a substitute, which has been distributed. Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and original text for purposes of amendment, and I recognize myself for an opening statement. H.R. 4155 helps veterans translate the skills they've learned in the military into civilian workforce. After 40 months with the unemployment rate over 8% and a growing number of our veterans facing difficulty finding jobs in post-deployment periods, this bill simply helps veterans return to work quickly by ensuring that training they received while on active duty is considered when applying for Federal occupational licenses. Some examples would be aviation and marine skills through the military training, for example, are very translatable. A military pilot certainly has the skills and the hours necessary to quickly transition to be a civilian pilot. Many would say he has skills that no civilian pilot would ever be able to achieve. These federally issued licenses are often at an additional cost, if not for this legislation. So the legislation has broad support, including the Association of the United States Army, the National Guard Association of the United States, the Military Officers Association of America, the Air Force Association, the Navy League, and the Association of the United States Navy. H.R. 4155 will help civilian employers take better advantage of the talent and unique skills experienced by returning soldiers. My amendment in the nature of a substitute makes certain technical corrections to the introduced bill. I urge members to support adoption. And does anyone else seek recognition for an opening statement? The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask that ranking member's statement be put into the record. I do.
Without objection, so ordered.
I want to say it has been befuddling to hear members of the armed forces complain that their training in the armed forces has proved worthless once they come home. It appears to me that the large unemployment rate may be related to the fact that we give no value to this training. This training, our military get under discipline that our own training, whether in corporations or in government programs, simply do not have. People come and go and they live their ordinary lives. When you are trained in the military, you're trained under the discipline of the military code. And the notion that that training is given no weight has seemed to me to be baffling. I can't understand what the other side of this particular issue is. So on behalf of the chairman and the ranking member, and myself, I strongly support this amendment.
I thank the gentlelady. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day for members who would like to submit a written statement.
Mr. Chairman.
Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of this bill because it would streamline the certification of licensing procedures for our returning service members by allowing relevant military training to be credited towards a federal license. Currently, about 200,000 service members transition to the civilian workforce each year, and I am concerned that a significant percentage of those veterans are experiencing some difficulty in finding employment. The civilian employment challenges faced by our returning servicemen and women are particularly troubling, given that the number of transitioning veterans is expected to rise significantly in the coming years in light of not only sequestration mandated budget cuts, but also last week we had a chance with several members of the committee to travel to Afghanistan. And as that withdrawal continues, the numbers needed in our military will de-escalate, and we'll be seeing more of these uniformed personnel transitioning to civilian service. Notably, many of these veterans served in our armed forces in highly specialized areas such as combat arms, motor transport, medical technicians or medics, and collectively these three specialties make up about 50% of the unemployed veterans here at home. These veterans have the skills to work in civilian careers in the federal and private sectors as air traffic controllers, and the chairman has already mentioned aircraft mechanic, airline pilots, nursing assistants, physician's assistants, ship engineers, but they would need to be licensed first. And this bill will make it easier and quicker for our veterans to be licensed based on their military training so that they can go right to work. For example, with the Department of Veterans Affairs as VA nurses or as physician's assistants where they are needed, and they are critically needed now. This bill is a good example of our commitment to help our dedicated uniformed service members transition to civilian life. It would have a positive effect on our veterans' lives and provide an additional pool of qualified talent for the Federal Government and the private sector for future employees. For these reasons, I support the passage of the bill and the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute, which would make minor and technical changes in the language of the underlying bill. I thank the Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 4155 to the House with the recommendation that it do pass as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is, or the motion is agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now consider H.R. 4631, the Government Spending Accountability Act, or the GSA Act of 2012. Without objection, H.R. 4631 will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4631, a bill to require quarterly reports on agency conferences and meetings and for other purposes.
I now recognize myself for a short opening statement. On February 9, 2009, the President publicly condemned the frivolous spending of taxpayer dollars at a town hall meeting in Indiana. He stated, you can't go take a trip to Las Vegas or go down to the Super Bowl on the taxpayer's dime. Unfortunately, the President was unable to follow up through his own message, and agencies did not take his warning. On April 2, 2012, Congress learned that the GSA, the General Services Administration, held a lavish conference at the M Resort and Spa just outside Las Vegas. The GSA conference held in October 2010 was condemned extensively as wasteful by the the Inspectors General of the GSA. Its cost was $822,751, which included $75,000 for a team-building event, a mind reader, several catered meals, and receptions. Attendees took home several souvenirs, such as a coffee table size book printed specifically for this event. In April, I joined with the ranking member in bringing to the floor H.R. 2146, the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or the DATA Act. Section 308 of the House-passed data bill limits Federal travel and conference spending and makes it more transparent. We will be considering today a standalone measure on travel and conferences introduced by Mr. Walsh of Illinois. It refines the language of Section 308 and highlights the necessity of our limiting the monitoring the multi-billion-dollar Federal travel and conference budget. I commend Mr. Walsh for bringing this bill, and I might note that this is a bipartisan bill, well regarded on both sides and supported by the Administration, who has, by executive order, already begun some of the process. And with that, I would ask that unanimous consent that the ranking member, Mr. Cummings' opening statement be placed in the record. Does anyone else seek recognition on an opening statement?
Mr. Chairman,
the gentlelady is recognized.
I want to say that after the outrageous GSA findings, which were discovered by its own internal auditors, there really does need to be a legislative response. It's not enough to say, go forward and send no more. And the best way to deter this kind of action is sunlight. And if you report to Congress on a regular basis, you're going to have that in mind as you plan your conferences. We strongly support this legislation.
I thank the gentlelady. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day so members may submit written statements. Mr. Walsh is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4631, the Government Spending Accountability Act, or GSA Act of 2012. Mr. Chairman, the recent—
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and original text for purposes of the amendment. I now recognize Mr. Walsh for purposes of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The recent scandal surrounding the GSA Western Regions Conference has shed light on the growing culture of bureaucratic entitlement that has ballooned within the Federal workforce. As we all know, wasteful and abusive spending on Federal travel and conferences is not isolated to this one lavish GSA event or even to just that agency. As our committee's own investigations have shown, excessive spending on conferences and travel stretches across the government. Federal spending on civilian government travel has exploded over this past decade, growing 88%. What this unchecked increase in spending power for Federal employees has done is evident. It has produced an environment where Federal employees recklessly spend taxpayer dollars as though those dollars are their own. My bill, the GSA Act, attacks this problem from two sides. First, the bill cuts travel spending by millions of dollars per year. Second, the GSA Act institutes strict reporting requirements to Congress so that never again will spending sprees go unchecked. This bill should have bipartisan support because this is not a political issue. The American people demand and deserve accountability regardless of political affiliation. President Obama included similar provisions in his FY 2012 budget request to address Federal employee travel expenses. My bill mirrors the President's request to ensure bipartisan support. So once again, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and report the GSA Act favorably to the floor. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and put a permanent stop to wasteful spending and abuse of taxpayer dollars. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the further discuss the bill? With that, the gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the sponsor's target here. I think it's entirely appropriate, and I support the amendment. What I am concerned about is we have the problem, which was illustrated or exemplified in this gross misuse of taxpayer funds for this conference in Vegas. My concern is that we stay focused on that type of misuse and not necessarily look at the legitimate uses of civilian travel. I am not surprised, I must say, by the statistic that has been put out there that civilian travel has increased 88% over the last 10 years. That 10 years represents a war in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan, where we have State Department, DEA, agriculture employees, a lot of civilian employees that have to travel back and forth to the war zone. That is not surprising to me, as well as the GAO, the many inspector generals that we've had on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that number does not surprise me as much as it might some others, having seen the activity on the part of the civilian government in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So, and I believe 99% of that is legitimate civilian performance of their governmental duties. I do agree with the gentleman, though, and the heart of his amendment is to go after this reckless and unacceptable spending on, conferences to Vegas and mind readers. I'd like to drill down into that at some point and figure out what they were using a mind reader for. Maybe we could use one of them here, but I think the gentleman's amendment is directly on point. I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that the taxpayer money is spent wisely and sparingly in terms of the appropriate use of the civilian workforce. So I thank the gentleman.
Would my colleague yield?
Sure, I will. Absolutely.
When he's finished.
Yeah.
I thank my colleague. I want to associate myself with his remarks, and I would just say to my friend from Illinois, I certainly am supportive of the underlying intent, but I would caution against generalizing from one bad example. I don't agree that this somehow characterizes the culture of the Federal workforce. It does not. We need to take care in this committee, it seems to me, to honor and respect the million Federal employees who do wonderful work for this country, who put themselves in harm's risk. I traveled with my friend from Massachusetts to Afghanistan and Iraq, and we saw civilian Federal employees standing shoulder to shoulder with our military, putting themselves in harm's way on behalf of their country. And so we need to deplore what occurred in Las Vegas. We need to ferret out whatever culture allowed that to continue from a management point of view, but please let us not generalize from that particular. Let's not somehow taint the entire Federal workforce with wrongdoing that, in fact, they had no say in and they did not participate in. And with that, I yield back to my friend from Massachusetts.
Would the gentleman further yield to the lady from
Of course, absolutely.
the District of Columbia?
I was pleased that I didn't hear characterizations of the Federal workforce in this discussion. I think it's pretty clear that the GSA outrage was an outlier, and I associate myself with the gentleman's remarks that we want to make sure that when we cite GSA over and over again, that is its own story. It's interesting that we have not had other stories of that kind, but I do believe that over time, if you're dealing with somebody else's money that's not your own, you can get careless. And that clearly happened at GSA. Nobody said that these employees hadn't been good employees, but they had been hanging out here at these conferences, and they got real careless when it wasn't their money. So the best deterrent is the kind of sunlight that comes from monitoring. And I support the gentleman's substitute, and I do not regard this bill or the substitute as a reflection on federal employees, but as a way of responding to the GSA virtual fraud, so that we never experience it again. And I think it will do the job. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does any member wish to offer an amendment? If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 4631 to the House with the recommendation it do pass as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed, or the motion is agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming and technical changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now consider H.R. 6016, the Government Employee Accountability Act. Without objection, H.R. 6016 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 6016, a bill to amend Title V, United States Code to provide for administrative leave requirements with respect to senior executive service employees and for other purposes.
I now recognize myself for an opening statement. This is a companion bill in many ways, dealing with the past sins of the GSA. As the gentlelady from the District of Columbia and the gentleman from Massachusetts previously said, this is not about a broad problem, but in fact about dealing with an anecdotal example that could not be unique, that needs in fact to send a message. The committee has held a hearing concerning wasteful spending that occurred during the planning and execution of GSA Administration's 2010 Western Regional Conference, where the GSA spent more than $820,000 on a conference originally budgeted and reasonably maximally budgeted for $250,000. GSA had no triggers or controls in place to stop this flagrant abuse of spending. GSA employees, including Jeff Neely, a career member of the Senior Executive Service, failed to follow his own GSA policies and Federal procurement law, or, for that matter, basic common sense. As has been previously said, they paid for a mind reader. I wish he could tell us what they were thinking. Mr. Neely, who has been referred to the Department of Justice for possible prosecution, was placed on GSA paid administrative leave after his wrongdoing was exposed to GSA IG. I want to make a particular note here. The misspending was, in fact, not technically criminal. However, the referral of Mr. Neely is for criminal activity that has not been made broadly public. Although it received an initial IG report in February, the GSA waited more than 2 months after the IG published its final management deficiency report in April before sending a notice of proposed removal to Mr. Neely. At that point, GSA still provided Mr. Neely with 30 days advance notice, although agencies are allowed by law to waive notice requirements if there is reason to believe the employee committed a crime that could result in imprisonment. H.R. 6016 helps ensure that in these extreme cases, senior executive service employees are held accountable for their action. It allows, on a limited basis, SESs, or senior executive service employees, to be fired for misappropriation of funds and gives the agency head discretion to place the SES on unpaid administrative leave. The core of this is, in fact, the latter, the unpaid administrative leave. If, in fact, you are reasonably suspected and charged with a crime, the idea that we continue to pay you on administrative leave seems to be unreasonable to be always the case. I commend Mr. Kelly for his work on this bill, and I urge members to support adoption of this ability for key career people to, in fact, make appropriate decisions on behalf of SESs working for them. And with that, I'd ask unanimous consent that Mr. Cummings' opening statement be placed in the record. Does anyone else seek recognition for opening statement? The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for an opening statement.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Having sat through a number of hearings on the GSA matter and having more and more of the misconduct come forward, I can certainly understand, particularly how the general public can't understand how a person continues to be paid. Typically, whether in state government or the federal government, and I believe that some of this has been pursuant to court suits because this is the government and the action is subject to due process. We are not, I think, paying people on administrative leave generally in the federal government because we'd like to. I believe this occurs because of due process rights that have been tested over and over again, and therefore the committee, our side, would like to work closely to immunize the bill from what I think are certain to be an almost invitation to be court suits unless we clarify the circumstances that would lead to essentially unpaid leave before there is any due process to show that either a crime or misconduct has taken place. That would be my concern, and it comes from years of seeing public employers at the state and local level have to abide outrage from the public when people who have clearly been involved in misconduct up to and including criminal misconduct receive their pay until such time as there is some due process adjudication, either administrative or judicial, to settle the issue. So that would be my only misgiving here. It is very difficult. We are not the first committee. This is not the first time government has been faced with this dilemma.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be glad to yield to the
I look
chairman.
forward to working with the gentlelady to ensure that's the case. Every effort has been taken in Mr. Kelly's bill to ensure that we do maintain the due process portions while giving a tool to, in this limited case of a referral, for this to be unpaid administrative leave. As the gentlelady knows, no matter what happens, ultimately, if at the end of the process somebody is in fact vindicated, they will get their entire amounts of money. So this process and how we're proposing doing it, I look forward to working with the gentlelady because I, too, want to make sure there's no injustice done.
Could I reclaim that? Mr. Chairman, does that mean that Mr. Neely, for example, who was, everybody's poster boy for somebody who should be fired, should have been, I don't know, put on administrative leave without pay when the report of the Inspector General came out?
I thank the gentlelady. At the point that the Inspector General discovered criminal activity by Mr. Neely.
That's who is criminal activity. That's the problem. When you get to the nub of the problem, when some official other than an official in the judicial system or in some administrative system, in fact, sanctions that there has been what you allege and what we all think is the case with Mr. Neely. And that it seems to me is the crux of the problem. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, I have never seen the problem solved. I have seen much worse cases than Mr. Neely continue to receive their pay in police departments, sheriffs, people who have been virtually had tomatoes thrown at them, and there's nothing that the government can do. And I don't think it's because the government felt comfortable doing it or couldn't think of something else to do. So I am doubtful, based on what I understand. I'm a constitutional lawyer based on what I understand the contours of due process to be, even with bad actors.
I thank the gentlelady. With that, the bill is open to amendment. Mr. Kelly is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
I thank Chairman. I have an amendment in the substitute, in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6016, offered by Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania.
Okay, this amendment includes clarifying language which further supports the intent of my bill. Again, we are giving Federal agencies the mechanisms they do not currently have. We've worked with the minority, and I urge all members to support its adoption. And I would say, Mr. Chairman, I think with this is a common sense solution. I think those of us that come out of the private sector look at this, and it's very hard to explain to people when I go back home in my district, why would we continue? We put somebody on administrative leave, continue to pay them, and when you talk to the people at the GSA, they said, well, you know what, we didn't have the mechanisms to stop that from happening. In fact, in the case that we talk about with the GSA and Mr. Neely, he was actually given a performance award, which some of us would call a bonus, and which I would call another further expense on taxpayers. You got a $9,000 bonus. Now, we're talking about the SES members at the highest level, and this does give those agency heads the ability to do what all of us think would be a common sense solution to it and a fix. It gives them the tools that they need to run their agencies the right way. So I think it makes sense what we're doing. And I would say this, that we have to be careful we don't paint everybody with the same brush. But what we're doing is we're giving these agency heads the opportunity to do what they haven't had in the past. We're giving them tools that they have not had at their disposal before.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, I could conceive of such tools, something comparable to a quick TRO process, where, in the absence of hearing what those tools are, I'm not sure what we mean. It does seem to me that if you go through the usual process, whether it's a civil service process and heaven knows a judicial process, you're going to be collecting your pay for some time. It does seem to me that agencies, perhaps this committee, could through legislation design quicker processes. Now, the courts do this all the time. You can come to court and ask for an immediate injunction. I'm not suggesting here that we want an injunction, but you can do something asking for an immediate injunction. And a court will hear that, and if it says, and if it believes that there is a likelihood that you will prevail in a hearing for preliminary injunction, you can get an immediate answer to an issue. Now, this is more of a civil action, but it does seem to me conceivable that we could design processes such as the gentleman is describing.
Well, and generally, this due process is protected under this. What it does do, it limits a 90 days administrative leave. It forces the agencies to move forward with it, and it would eliminate in the public's mind, why are we going on and on and on with something? It requires a 2-week reporting period for the agencies to get back to the committee to let them know what the progress is on. It does not leave the employee in limbo, not knowing what's going to happen. It also protects taxpayer funds, which I think at the end of the day, all of us in the private sector would start to wonder about how can you pay somebody on administrative leave. I'm not denying their due process. I don't think any of us want to do that. And the other thing, you want to be very careful not to paint anybody with the same brush. But we have seen instances where this takes place, and there's just nothing in place right now for the heads of these agencies to handle it. And I've sensed their frustration. I can't imagine running a bureau or an agency where your hands are tied and you can't do what you know is right. So what this does, it puts those, again, a tool that they have not had previously. It gives them mechanics to do what I think all common sense and thoughtful people would consider good legislation.
The gentleman yields back. The amendment in nature of a substitute has been distributed. Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and original text for purposes of amending. And I thank the gentleman for his comments on the amendment. I now recognize myself in support of the amendment. I believe it is important that we understand that nothing in this bill, including the amendment, would change the basic tenets of the Merit System Board, that ultimately a request by an administrator or the decision by an administrator to place an individual on unpaid administrative leave would be subject to the same due process appeals that every employee has. So no different than a notice that you're being fired would be a notice that, in fact, you're going to be placed on administrative leave. As we all understand that if there is no mechanism to allow for a unpaid leave as an option, then, in fact, somebody like the GSA administrator, Martha Johnson, would find herself with no option but to continue paying somebody, even though it is clear in her mind, it was clear that this was an extreme example, that the IG report was alleging criminal activity, and determination would be likely. So it is an additional tool, and it is, most importantly, a tool that could be used after determination of a crime had been committed, after the need to place somebody on administrative leave, so that, in fact, they were not performing a duty for which there was serious doubt. However, any employee feeling that this administrative leave, whether paid or unpaid, was inappropriate would still have the merit system to fall back onto. So the due process is maintained. Nothing in here is taking away those rights for these SES employees. I recognize that this is one of those situations in which the private sector that Mr. Kelly comes from and I come from and the government sector have differences. In the private sector, in a non-union environment and even sometimes in a union environment, if you find somebody with their hand in the cookie jar, as you call the police, you fire them. Now, they can sue you and they can prove that, in fact, it wasn't their hand, it wasn't your cookie jar, but they are still fired until or unless they prove back. In this case, the due process is much more extensive and takes longer, and I join with the gentlelady in the belief that we should try in this modern age to streamline whatever possible. However, this relatively narrow additional tool will not change the long process that sometimes occurs in terminating an employee, and it certainly will not change the amount of time it takes for somebody who has, in the case of Mr. Neely, used a government credit card for personal purchases in complete violation of the very rules that GSA sets up. It will not change the fact that that is a fairly long criminal process in which they have rights. Having said that, I might note nothing in this bill does what the American people would like to do, which is to strip Mr. Neely of his otherwise well-earned retirement for the years in which he was wasting government money. I might note that we in the Congress stripped ourselves of our retirement should we be convicted of a serious crime while in office. We're not proposing doing that. I don't believe we should at this time, but I do believe that this limited capability is appropriate and well guarded, and I hope that after this markup is completed, we can work with staff to ensure the gentlelady from the District of Columbia understands that we absolutely will make sure that all due process is maintained in the bill. And I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record a letter addressed to yourself and Mr. Cummings, the ranking member, from the Senior Executives Association on this piece of legislation.
Without objection, so ordered. Would you like to characterize that letter?
I thank the Chair. This letter raises some concerns, and I want to say to my friend from Pennsylvania and to the Chairman, I am very sympathetic with the intent of this legislation. I do think it might have been useful to have had a hearing before we marked up this bill, so that we heard what concerns there might be. The gentlelady,
if the gentleman would yield,
yes,
we did have a hearing that really prompted this legislation. I hope the gentleman knows that.
And I do recognize that, but I think with respect to the specifics of the legislation, Mr. Chairman, hearing from interested parties might have illuminated some of the issues we're now talking about. I associate myself with the gentlelady from D.C., from Washington, D.C., in terms of a concern for due process. And I would remind my colleagues, people can be accused of all kinds of things where it may not be true. Our late colleague in the Senate, Ted Stevens, had his case posthumously expunged because of, frankly, the withholding of relevant information to his defense by prosecutors gone wild. And yet, in the press, Senator Stevens was pretty much convicted, and under this kind of legislation, perhaps had he worked in a senior executive position in the Federal Government, might have innocently nonetheless been removed or judged or lost benefits. And so I urge us to proceed with caution. It is clear that you're going to approve this piece of legislation today. I would certainly ask the Chairman and my friend Mr. Kelly from Pennsylvania work with us on this side for bipartisan cooperation to make sure that we iron out the kinks so that we, in fact, are doing what we intend to do.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
Mr. Kelly's amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporates all comments made by the minority after the hearing that we knew of as of today, and I do pledge to work with the gentleman from Virginia to ensure that any additional areas of concern are addressed before this comes to the floor.
I thank the Chair, and I pledge similarly to work with you and my friend Mr. Kelly. Some of the concerns I'm referring to are, in fact, enumerated in this legislation, and we'll have an opportunity between now and when we bring this to the floor to try to address it.
Will the gentleman yield?
Of course.
In the process, Mr. Chairman, I was surprised to know that there was no way to do anything about someone who's been accused of something serious. And what concerns me is that there is a procedure where, after 7 days' notice, exactly what we're talking about can take place. And I want to know, why isn't it being used? Has it been proved ineffective? But it looks like, in the code, we tried to do this already, and we need to know, and I hope that perhaps in whatever discussions, why the cause and procedure section has not been used, which appears to allow the agencies to move even more quickly than the 90 days in the gentleman's amendment.
If the gentleman would further yield.
Yes, of course.
It's in fact that exact situation in which misappropriation of funds is not covered that we're amending.
Yeah, it says criminal. Yeah, it's true that it does not apply to matters involving criminal matters. And what does that mean? Did Mr. Neely's involve criminal matters or not? It's very much worth exploring. And I am convinced there's a way to do it, but we've got to be very careful in the process.
The gentleman yields back. If there's are there any further amendments? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 6016 to the House with the recommendation it do pass as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming and technical changes to the bill without objection, so ordered. The committee will now consider the activities report for the first half of the second session of the 112th Congress. And I recognize myself for a quick opening statement. On January 5th, the House of Representatives adopted rules for the 112th Congress, increasing transparency and improving responsibility to the American people. Last June, the committee marked up its first semi-annual activity report. In December, the committee marked up its second semi-annual report. And now we mark up our third semi-annual activity report, covering the activity from January 2012 through May. In the past years, these reports have been filed only once per Congress. I then and now continue to believe that the exercise of reviewing on a twice-a-year basis is essential. Pursuant to Rule 11, Clause 1D, the report must summarize the oversight plan approved by the committee at the beginning of the Congress, the legislative and oversight activities conducted by the committee. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, the report must include separate listings of any hearing conducted on waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement of government programs in our jurisdiction, government programs recommended for review by agency inspectors general, government programs included on the Government Accountability Office's biannual high-risk list. Additionally, pursuant to HRES 72, any oversight or legislative activity conducted as part or as a result of the inventory and review of existing, pending, and proposed legislation and orders. The minority is encouraged to offer their own views, and with that, I would recognize the ranking member for her statement.
Mr. Chairman, we have no amendments nor objections to the report.
I thank the gentlelady. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day. Members may submit written statements. We will now open the report for consideration. Without objection, the report will be considered as read and open for amendments at any point. The report has been read and distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the report.
A report of the activities of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform for the first half of the second session of the 112th Congress.
Does any member wish to speak further on the report? If there is no further discussion, I move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform approve the activities report for the first half of the second session of the 112th Congress. The question is on reporting the activities report for the first half of the second session of the 112th Congress to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The report is agreed to. And with that, we stand adjourned. Oops. Wait a second. With that, we do not stand adjourned. Oh, we saved the best for last. I now ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Federal Workforce, U.S. Postal Service, and Labor Policy from consideration as necessary and to favorably report to the House H.R. 5837, H.R. 3912, H.R. 4389, H.R. 2896, H.R. 2338, and H.R. 1369. Does any member wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
If you could for just a moment. Hang on, Ms. Burkle. Yes, the gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we support these 8 postal naming bills, and before closing, we continue to express our interest in meeting with you to discuss comprehensive postal reform and alternative language to H.R. 2309 that has been developed. I thank the Chairman and yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Burkle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to present H.R. 5837 for consideration here today. This legislation will designate the United States Postal Service located at 26 East Genesee Street in Baldwinsville, New York, as the Corporal Kyle R. Schneider Post Office Building. Kyle Schneider was born on January 8, 1988, to Richard and Lori Snyder. He was raised in the Baldwinsville, New York area with his brother Kevin. He graduated from Baker High School in Baldwinsville and attended Onondaga Community College for 1 year. In March of 2008, Kyle joined the United States Marine Corps and graduated from boot camp in June of 2008. He attended the School of Infantry in July and graduated in September. And from September to October, he attended the Marine Corps Security Forces training. In October of 2008, he was the Guard Company Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C., and in May of 2010, he was transferred to Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment. In January 2011, Kyle was assigned to the 3rd Platoon and deployed to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. In defense of our nation, Kyle was killed in Helmand Province, Afghanistan on June 30, 2011 by an improvised explosive device. Kyle Snyder was 23 years old. Corporal Kyle Snyder is an American hero. He was a proud and valiant Marine. He was also a son, a brother, a grandson, a fiancé, a friend, and comrade. Kyle is greatly missed, and no words will diminish the grief of those who knew and loved him. In his death, he has earned the thanks of this grateful nation. Let us honor the service and sacrifice of Corporal Kyle Snyder through the passage of this legislation to designate the Baldwinsville Post Office in his honor. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Additionally, H.R. 5788 will also be subject to unanimous consent. If there is no one further to speak on the bills, I ask unanimous consent that all these bills be approved in their presented form. Without objection, so ordered. Now the committee stands adjourned.